You're fired." The words landed harder than Marcus Reed expected. Not because he loved the job, because his 10-year-old daughter was counting on it. In front of investors, executives, and hotel staff, CEO Cassandra Vale pointed toward the exit. Nobody spoke. A few people looked away. One investor smirked. Marcus glanced at the folded paper lighthouse sticking out of his jacket pocket, a gift his daughter Ava had handed him that morning before school. Then he looked toward the control room monitors. "Tonight's transfer cycle is going to fail," he said calmly. "If someone forces a reset, the entire hotel could lose power." The room responded with silence. Then dismissal. 3 hours later, Marcus was sitting at his kitchen table, staring at an overdue school payment notice with Ava's science fair flyer beside it. That was when the lights went out across the luxury hotel. Elevators stopped. Guests became trapped. Emergency systems began failing. And the same executives who had laughed at him suddenly realized something terrifying. The man they fired was the only person who had seen it coming. Marcus Reed's day started before sunrise. The apartment was still dark when he stepped into the kitchen and switched on the coffee maker. For a few seconds, he simply stood there. Tired. Not physically. Financially. Emotionally. The kind of tired that came from doing calculations every morning before your feet even touched the floor. Rent. Groceries. School expenses. The electricity bill sitting unopened on the counter. He picked up a small envelope and looked at it again. Ava's school science fair registration. The payment deadline was Friday. Marcus checked his bank account on his phone. The balance wasn't encouraging. He slipped the phone into his pocket before Ava could see it. A few moments later, his daughter appeared in the doorway wearing mismatched socks and carrying a stack of construction paper. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, kiddo." She placed the paper on the table. Marcus smiled. Another school project. The science fair. Her eyes lit up immediately. "I'm building a lighthouse." A lighthouse. It helps people find their way when everything gets dark. Marcus laughed softly. "That's a pretty good idea." For the next 10 minutes, Ava carefully folded blue paper while explaining her project. Marcus listened. Not because he understood every detail, because these moments mattered. Eventually, she handed him a small paper lighthouse. The edges weren't perfect. One side leaned slightly, but it was made with the kind of care only a child could give. "You keep it." Marcus turned it over in his hands. "For luck?" Ava shook her head. "No." Then she smiled. "So you remember where you're supposed to go?" The answer stayed with him, even after he dropped her off at school, even after he drove toward the Charleston waterfront, even after the massive glass structure of the Vail Grand Charleston Harbor Hotel came into view. Inside the hotel, chaos hid behind luxury. Employees rushed through hallways. Managers reviewed schedules. Florists carried arrangements through the lobby. The evening investor showcase was the biggest event of the year. Hundreds of millions of dollars in future expansion projects depended on tonight's presentation. Nobody felt that pressure more than Cassandra Vale. The CEO stood near the ballroom entrance reviewing reports while board members followed close behind. She hadn't slept much lately. The company had missed earnings targets twice. Investors were becoming impatient. Several board members were quietly discussing leadership changes. Another failed presentation could cost her more than money. It could cost her position. That fear followed her everywhere. Meanwhile, Marcus pushed his maintenance cart through a service corridor beneath the East Conference Wing. A flicker caught his attention. One ceiling light blinked. just once, then stopped. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Marcus did. A few minutes later, an automatic door hesitated before opening. Not enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to feel wrong. Then, an ice machine in a service kitchen unexpectedly restarted itself. Again, small things, unimportant by themselves, but patterns rarely arrived all at once. They arrived in pieces. Marcus paused near a utility panel. The building dashboard displayed normal conditions. Green indicators. No active faults. No warnings. Everything looked perfect. Yet another hallway light flickered briefly. This time Marcus frowned. Machines often whispered before they screamed. And this building had started whispering. He pulled out a notebook and wrote down 3 observations. Light fluctuation. Door delay. Unexpected equipment reset. Then he looked toward the ceiling. Something was happening beneath the surface. The problem was that nobody would pay attention until it became impossible to ignore. And by then, it might already be too late. By noon, the hotel looked flawless. That was the problem. The more perfect everything appeared, the less willing anyone became to hear bad news. Marcus Reed spent most of the afternoon moving between service corridors, utility rooms, and maintenance stations beneath the hotel. Everywhere he went, he noticed little things. A digital information display near the ballroom suddenly rebooted. A service elevator paused for 3 seconds before responding. An electronic door lock flashed red before correcting itself. Nothing serious. Not yet. But the incidents were becoming more frequent. Each one felt like a warning. By themselves, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. At 1:15 p.m., Marcus stopped by a maintenance office and reviewed the previous month's incident reports. The records confirmed what he already suspected. Tiny electrical irregularities had appeared several times during the last few weeks. Most had been dismissed as isolated glitches. Nobody had connected them. Nobody except Marcus. He circled several entries with a pen. Unscheduled reboot. Brief communication loss. Controller timeout. Lighting reset. Different symptoms. Same root cause. Or at least that was his suspicion. A knock interrupted his thoughts. When he looked up, he saw Evan Holloway, the consulting engineer hired to oversee the hotel's infrastructure certification, SOMOIU. Evan carried himself with the confidence of someone whose opinion was rarely questioned. His suit probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. "You've been chasing ghost problems again," Evan asked with a smile. Marcus slid the reports across the desk. "Take a look." Evan glanced at them, then handed them back. "Minor system noise. Maybe. The diagnostics are clean." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "The diagnostics were clean before every major failure I've ever investigated." That earned a brief pause. Not because Evan agreed. Because he didn't expect a maintenance technician to answer that way. Still, the consultant shook his head. "We have investors arriving in a few hours." Marcus nodded. "I know. We don't need people creating unnecessary concerns." Marcus stared at him for a moment, then asked a simple question. "If a patient has chest pain, do you ignore it because the heartbeat monitor looks normal?" Evan frowned. "This isn't a hospital." "No." Marcus looked toward the corridor. "But systems behave the same way." The conversation ended there. Neither man changed the other's mind. As Evan walked away, Marcus felt a familiar frustration. Not anger, just disappointment. People often trusted screens more than reality. Especially expensive screens. Later that afternoon, Marcus passed the executive offices. Through a partially open conference room door, he overheard part of a conversation. The board chairman's voice was unmistakable. "We cannot afford another setback. Cassandra." Marcus slowed his pace. Inside the room, Cassandra Vale stood beside a presentation screen. Several board members sat around a polished table. The atmosphere felt tense. "We need this investment announcement," another board member said. "The market is watching." Cassandra remained composed. But Marcus noticed something others might miss. Her hand tightened around a pen. Only slightly. Just enough to reveal pressure. For the first time, he understood something important. She wasn't simply arrogant. She was scared. Scared of failure. Scared of losing control. Scared of becoming the next person blamed if things went wrong. The realization didn't excuse her behavior, but it made her human. Marcus continued walking. A few minutes later, he entered a service hallway beneath the ballroom. Then he stopped. The overhead lights flickered twice. Not once. Twice. Several employees looked up. One caterer frowned. Another worker glanced around uneasily. For the first time all day, other people noticed it too. The building wasn't whispering anymore. It was getting louder. And with every passing hour, Marcus became more certain that whatever was hiding inside the hotel's infrastructure was running out of patience. At 5:40 p.m., the first investors began arriving. Luxury sedans lined the entrance. Valets moved quickly. Photographers positioned themselves near the ballroom doors. From the outside, the Vail Grand Charleston Harbor Hotel looked like a company celebrating success. Inside, tension sat beneath every smile. Marcus Reed was standing in a service corridor when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Ava. A photo appeared on the screen. She was standing beside her unfinished science fair project, grinning proudly. The paper lighthouse was nearly complete. Under the photo, she had written, "Don't forget, tomorrow after school." Marcus smiled despite himself. He had promised to be there, no matter what. He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked toward the ballroom. Then another light flickered. This time, several guests noticed. A few glanced upward. The light stabilized almost immediately. Most people ignored it. Marcus didn't. He headed straight toward the maintenance office and pulled together his notes. The pattern had become impossible to dismiss. Lighting fluctuations, door delays, controller resets, communication interruptions. Each symptom pointed toward the same hidden problem. The building was approaching peak electrical demand, and whatever was buried inside the infrastructure was getting worse. Marcus looked at the clock. 6:12 p.m. The investor presentation would begin shortly. If he was going to warn someone, it had to be now. A few minutes later, he entered the executive conference suite. The timing could not have been worse. Investors filled the room. Board members sat around the table. Consultants reviewed final reports. Cassandra Vale stood at the center of it all. Confident. Controlled. Determined to make the evening a success. Then Marcus walked in carrying a folder. Several executives immediately looked annoyed. Cassandra's expression hardened. "What is this?" Marcus placed the reports on the table. "I need 5 minutes." "You don't have 5 minutes. I think you need to hear this." The room shifted uncomfortably. Nobody liked unexpected problems before an important event. Marcus opened the folder. "The electrical instability we've been seeing isn't random." Evan Holloway sighed. "Not this again." Marcus ignored him. "The symptoms are increasing. The building is approaching a transfer sequence under peak demand. If it happens tonight, Evan interrupted. The diagnostics are clean. Marcus looked directly at him. The lights are already flickering. No one answered. Because everyone in the room had seen it, even if only briefly. Cassandra crossed her arms. What exactly are you suggesting? Marcus took a breath. I'm suggesting that we're treating warning signs as isolated incidents. The system isn't healthy. It's hiding a problem. One investor exchanged a worried look with another. The timing was terrible. The board members noticed. Cassandra noticed too. Every minute spent discussing risk threatened the confidence she had worked months to build. She felt the pressure immediately. The investors, the board, the possibility of losing control of the company. Fear disguised itself as certainty, and certainty pushed her toward a decision. A bad one. We are not stopping tonight's event because a maintenance technician has a theory. The room fell quiet. Marcus remained calm. This isn't a theory. It's a warning. The words landed heavily. For a moment, Cassandra's confidence cracked. Then she saw investors watching. The moment passed. Her voice became colder. You've crossed a line. Marcus didn't move. Cassandra, you're done. The room froze. Several employees lowered their eyes. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended him. Hours of preparation. Years of service. Gone in a sentence. Cassandra pointed toward the door. Turn in your badge before you leave. Marcus felt humiliation rise inside him. Then he thought about Ava. About the science fair. About the paper lighthouse. He swallowed the anger. Picked up his folder, and before leaving, offered one final warning. When the problem starts, don't force a manual reset. No one answered. Marcus walked out. Behind him, the presentation resumed. Ahead of him, the biggest mistake of the night had already been made. Marcus sat in his truck for nearly 10 minutes before starting the engine. The hotel's employee parking lot was still visible through the windshield. For 6 years, he had parked in the same spot. 6 years of late-night repairs, emergency calls, holiday shifts, missed dinners, missed weekends. Now it was over. Just like that. His phone buzzed. A text message from Ava. Are you still coming tomorrow? Marcus stared at the screen. The science fair. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He had promised. And now he wasn't even sure if he could afford the registration fee. The thought hurt more than losing the job. He typed back. Wouldn't miss it. The response came immediately. A smiling emoji, then a picture of the paper lighthouse sitting on her desk. Marcus smiled despite everything. By the time he reached home, darkness had settled over Charleston Harbor. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Bills still sat on the kitchen counter. The science fair envelope sat beside them. Marcus opened his banking app again. The numbers hadn't changed. He laughed softly at himself, as if checking a second time would somehow help. Ava noticed. Dad. He quickly locked the screen. Yeah. She hesitated, then asked carefully. Did something bad happen at work? Children often understood more than adults realized. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat beside her. I lost my job. The words sounded strange out loud. Ava lowered her eyes. Oh. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, she asked the question he feared most. Are we gonna be okay? Marcus felt something tighten inside his chest. Not panic. responsibility, the heavy kind, the kind every parent knows. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Yeah. The answer came quickly, almost automatically, because that's what fathers do, even when they're not completely sure. Ava nodded slowly, then pushed the paper lighthouse toward him. So you don't forget. Marcus looked down. Forget what? Where you're supposed to go? The same answer she had given that morning. Only now it meant something different. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. 3 notifications in less than 10 seconds. He picked it up. Messages from former co-workers. East ballroom lights flickering. Service elevators acting weird. Kitchen equipment restarting. Marcus felt his stomach sink. The pattern was accelerating. Right on schedule. Across town, the investor reception was in full swing. Champagne glasses clinked. Executives smiled for photographs. Investors discussed expansion plans. Yet beneath the luxury and confidence, warning signs continued spreading through the building. A digital display near the lobby rebooted unexpectedly. A service elevator paused between floors before recovering. Several hallway lights dimmed for a split second. Guests noticed. Managers pretended not to. Evan Holloway reassured everyone that the building remained stable. The dashboard still showed green. The report still looked clean. The illusion remained intact. For now. At 9:08 p.m., another text arrived. Something's really wrong. Marcus stood and walked toward the apartment window. Across the harbor, the hotel glowed against the night sky. Beautiful. Expensive. Vulnerable. His phone rang. Hotel operations. Marcus let it ring. Then another call arrived. And another. The people who had ignored his warning were finally starting to see the same danger he had seen hours earlier. The difference was that now they were running out of time. And somewhere inside the hotel, the first domino had already started to fall. At 9:21 p.m., the first elevator stopped. A family returning from dinner felt the car shudder once before it froze between floors. The lights remained on. Barely. The emergency intercom crackled with static. Then silence. Inside the control room, technicians immediately noticed the alert. One elevator outage wasn't a crisis. Yet. 3 minutes later, a second elevator stalled. Then a third. The atmosphere inside the hotel changed instantly. Guests who had been enjoying cocktails moments earlier were now asking questions. Managers stopped smiling. Security radios became noticeably busier. Across the harbor, Marcus stood by his apartment window watching his phone light up with notifications. The messages were arriving faster now. Something's wrong. Elevator issue. Lobby screens rebooting. Power fluctuations everywhere. Marcus didn't need the updates. He already knew where the story was heading. The question was whether anyone at the hotel would realize it before making things worse. At 9:29 p.m., the ballroom lights flickered. Not once. 3 times. The investors noticed immediately. Conversation stopped. Several people looked upward. A few reached for their phones. Across the room, Cassandra Vale forced a smile and continued speaking. She could feel control slipping away. The board members noticed too. One of them quietly checked his watch. Another stared at the flickering lights with visible concern. Every second increased the pressure. Every second increased the risk that tonight's presentation would become a disaster. Then it happened. At exactly 9:34 p.m., the entire ballroom went dark. Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped a glass. A woman screamed. Emergency lighting activated several seconds later, bathing the room in dim red illumination. The luxury atmosphere disappeared instantly. Now it felt like an evacuation zone. Throughout the hotel, alarms began sounding. Guests emerged into hallways. Service staff rushed in every direction. The outage spread floor by floor. Not because the hotel had lost power, because the hotel's systems no longer agreed on where power should go. Inside the control room, chaos erupted. Technicians stared at flashing warnings. Screens filled with contradictory information. Some systems reported normal operation. Others reported critical failures. Neither version matched reality. Evan Holloway stepped toward the main console. Run a recovery sequence. A technician hesitated. We're still diagnosing. Do it. The command was executed. For a brief moment, part of the hotel came back online. Several hallway lights returned. An elevator restarted. A few employees cheered. Then everything failed again. Harder. More violently. Additional alarms appeared. Emergency transfer relays began cycling. Backup controllers started rejecting commands. The building was fighting itself. Exactly as Marcus had warned. A young technician swallowed nervously. He told us not to force a reset. Nobody answered. Because everyone remembered the warning, the meeting, the firing, the humiliation. Another alert appeared. East Tower emergency lighting unstable. A second alert followed. Backup refrigeration failure. Then another. Guest evacuation assistance requested. The consequences were becoming human now. Not technical. Human. People trapped. People waiting. People scared. Cassandra stared at the screens. Hours earlier, she had worried about investors. Now she worried about safety. The difference felt enormous. She looked around the room. Highly paid consultants. Engineers. Managers. Specialists. Nobody had a solution. For the first time that night, she felt genuine fear. Not fear of losing a business deal. Not fear of disappointing investors. Fear that innocent people were paying the price for a mistake. Her mistake. Then a technician quietly said what everyone else was already thinking. We need Marcus. The room fell still. No one argued. No one laughed. No one defended their earlier decisions, Simerson. Outside, another section of the hotel disappeared into darkness. And for the first time that night, Cassandra reached for her phone not to call investors, not to call the board, but to call the man she had fired only 3 hours earlier. Marcus stared at Cassandra Vale's name on the screen. The phone continued ringing. Across the table, Ava watched him carefully. Neither of them moved. The ringing stopped. Then started again, almost immediately. Marcus already knew what the call meant. The hotel was no longer dealing with flickering lights and frozen elevators. The crisis had reached the point where pride no longer mattered. Only consequences did. Ava looked toward the phone. Is that work? Marcus nodded. Sort of. The phone stopped again. This time, a voicemail notification appeared. Then another. Then a text message. Please call. It's urgent. Marcus placed the phone face down on the table. Part of him wanted to leave it there. Not because he hated Cassandra. Not because he wanted revenge. Because he was tired. Tired of being ignored until a problem became expensive. Tired of being invisible until someone needed him. Tired of always being the last person people listened to and the first person they blamed. Ava studied his face. Dad. Yeah. She hesitated, then asked quietly, Are people in trouble? The question landed harder than any phone call. Marcus looked away, toward the stack of bills, toward the science fair registration form, toward the future that had suddenly become uncertain. Then he thought about the hotel. Families trapped in elevators. Employees trying to guide frightened guests through dark hallways. Maintenance workers carrying flashlights through service corridors. People who had nothing to do with his firing. People who simply needed help. Yeah, he said softly. I think they are. Ava looked down at the paper lighthouse sitting on the table, then pushed it toward him. The gesture was small, almost nothing. But Marcus understood. The lighthouse wasn't about luck. It never had been. It was about finding your way when things got dark. A few seconds later, the phone rang again. Marcus answered. Cassandra. For a moment, neither person spoke. The contrast between now and the conference room was striking. Gone was the confident CEO. Gone was the woman who had fired him in front of investors. When Cassandra finally spoke, her voice sounded exhausted. We need your help. Marcus waited. The consultants can't stabilize the system. Another pause. Then she added something she probably hadn't said in years. I was wrong. The words hung in the silence. Not dramatic. Not rehearsed. Just honest. Marcus looked out the apartment window toward the harbor. The hotel stood partially dark against the night skyline. A wound of black glass among the city lights. What happened after the outage? He asked. Cassandra quickly explained. The recovery attempt. The relay cycling. The emergency lighting failures. The worsening instability. Marcus listened carefully. With every sentence, the picture became clearer. Exactly what he feared. Exactly what he expected. Finally, he asked a simple question. East Tower stairwell lights. Silence. What about them? Are they flickering? A few muffled voices sounded in the background. Someone checked reports. Several seconds passed. Then Cassandra returned. Yes. Marcus nodded. The room on the other end went quiet. Because he hadn't guessed. He had known. The South Emergency Network is next, Marcus said. A technician immediately shouted something in the background. More voices followed. A fresh alarm had appeared. Exactly where Marcus predicted. Nobody interrupted him now. Nobody dismissed him. Nobody laughed. The crisis had stripped away titles, assumptions, and ego. Only reality remained. Marcus stood and reached for his jacket. The paper lighthouse was still inside the pocket. Ava looked up. You're going back? Marcus smiled faintly. Yeah. She nodded. Not because the people at the hotel deserved it. Because helping people was still the right thing to do. 20 minutes later, Marcus was driving back toward the harbor, toward the building, toward the people who needed him, and toward the longest night of his life. The employee entrance opened before Marcus reached it. A security supervisor was already waiting. Not because Marcus held authority, because everyone inside the building was running out of options. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed something important. People had stopped arguing. Panic had finally exhausted confidence. Employees moved quickly through dim hallways carrying flashlights. Guests sat in lobby areas waiting for updates. A young mother held a sleeping child against her shoulder. An elderly couple waited beside a dark elevator banks. The crisis suddenly felt much larger than a hotel. These weren't customers anymore. They were people depending on a system that had failed them. Marcus headed straight for the control room. The conversations inside stopped the moment he entered. Not completely. Just enough. Enough to feel the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. Cassandra stood near the main console. The strain on her face was obvious now. Hours earlier, she had looked like a CEO protecting a company. Now she looked like someone carrying responsibility. Marcus didn't mention the firing. Didn't ask for an apology. Didn't make anyone uncomfortable. He simply walked to the monitors. "Show me the live relay activity." A technician immediately pulled up the data. Marcus studied it for less than 30 seconds, then pointed toward one section of the display. "That's wrong." Evan Holloway stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Marcus pointed again. "You're looking at command signals. So you're assuming the system is doing what it's being told." The room became quiet. Marcus turned toward another screen. "Show me actual relay position feedback." A technician hesitated. "We haven't been monitoring that." Marcus nodded. "I know." The data appeared. The difference was immediate. The command system claimed several transfer relays were open. The physical feedback showed they were closed. A few engineers stared at the screen, then at each other. For the first time all night, the problem became visible, not as a theory, as evidence. "The dashboard isn't lying," Marcus said calmly. "It's asking the wrong question." Nobody spoke. He continued. "Everyone keeps checking what the system wants to do." He tapped the display. "We should be checking what it's actually doing." The realization hit the room like a wave. Hours of confusion suddenly began making sense. Evan slowly removed his glasses. "My God." Marcus nodded. "The controllers are fighting for authority." A technician swallowed. "So how do we stop it?" Marcus grabbed a marker and drew a simple diagram on a whiteboard. No complicated engineering language. Just arrows. Boxes. Connections. Imagine 3 people trying to steer the same car. The room watched. One turns left, one turns right. One tries to correct both. What happens? "The car crashes," someone answered. "Exactly." Marcus drew a circle around one specific pathway, Hunt's. "This is where the argument starts." He pointed toward a relay group buried deep inside the emergency network. "Isolate it." Several technicians exchanged nervous looks. Evan looked at the data, then nodded. "Do it." The command was executed. The room waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Then one alarm disappeared. A second followed. Then another. Across the hotel, sections of lighting began stabilizing. Several hallways returned to full brightness. A technician looked up from his monitor. "West Tower is recovering." Another voice followed. "Elevator diagnostics are coming back online." For the first time that night, hope entered the room. Real hope. Not optimism. Evidence. Marcus wasn't finished. But everyone could finally see the same thing. The crisis wasn't getting worse anymore. And for the first time since the lights went out, the hotel had a path back. The first section of the hotel came back to life at 11:07 p.m. A row of lobby lights brightened. Then the reception desk monitors restarted. A moment later, applause erupted somewhere down the hallway. Not loud. Not celebratory. Relieved. The kind of applause people gave when they finally believed things might be okay. Inside the control room, nobody was celebrating yet. Marcus Reed remained focused on the screens. One mistake could still reverse everything. The relay isolation had stopped the system from fighting itself. Now they had to restore authority to the network, one section at a time. Carefully, patiently, without rushing. The exact opposite of what had caused the crisis. "Bring East Tower online next," Marcus said. A technician nodded and executed the sequence. The room waited. Several seconds passed. Then another group of alarms disappeared. No new faults appeared. No instability. No conflict. The recovery was holding. A wave of relief spread through the room. Even Evan Holloway looked like he could breathe again. Then a voice suddenly came from the archive terminal. "Wait." Everyone turned. One of the younger technicians was staring at an old infrastructure file. His eyes narrowed, then widened. "What is it?" Cassandra asked. The technician didn't answer immediately. Instead, he clicked through several archived documents. Original commissioning reports. Emergency system reviews. Infrastructure modification records. The files dated back more than a decade. Long before most people in the room had ever worked at the hotel. Then he stopped. There. A scanned engineering document filled the screen. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. A recommendation regarding emergency transfer authority conflicts. The exact problem they had spent hours fighting tonight. Beneath the note sat a signature. Marcus Reed. The room became still. The technician opened another document. Then another. And another. The same handwriting. The same name. The same signature. Years of records. Years of engineering notes. Years of solutions. Evan slowly stepped closer. "You wrote these." Marcus glanced at the screen. "Some of them." The answer sounded almost casual. That somehow made it more powerful. A photograph appeared next. A commissioning team standing inside the unfinished control center 11 years earlier. The building around them was still under construction. Concrete walls, exposed wiring, temporary lighting. At the center of the group stood a younger Marcus, holding blueprints, discussing something with senior engineers. The room stared. Nobody spoke. A manager slowly lowered the tablet in his hands. An engineer's fingers froze above a keyboard. Someone's coffee cup stopped halfway to their mouth. Across the reflection of a dark monitor, Marcus's name remained visible. The silence felt heavier than applause. Hours earlier, some of those same people had watched him get fired. Some had looked away. Some had remained silent. A few had even smiled. Now nobody could meet his eyes. Cassandra stared at the photograph. Then at Marcus. Then back at the photograph again. Understanding arrived slowly. Painfully. Not because Marcus had secretly been important, because he had been telling the truth from the beginning, and nobody had listened. Finally, Cassandra spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You helped design this system." Marcus shook his head. "Part of a team. Again. No ego. No performance. No attempt to make anyone feel smaller. Just honesty. That made the moment even harder for everyone else." The evidence sat on the screen. The outage. The warnings. The firing. The consequences. Every piece connected. And in the middle of it all stood the man they had mistaken for someone whose opinion didn't matter. Outside the control room windows, more sections of the hotel illuminated against the Charleston night. The building was recovering, but inside the room, something else had changed. The assumptions that had guided everyone's judgment were gone, and they weren't coming back. By 1:43 a.m., the final emergency alert disappeared from the control room monitors. The hotel was stable. Not partially stable. Not temporarily stable. Stable. For the first time in hours, nobody was waiting for another alarm. Nobody was bracing for another failure. The crisis was over. A quiet wave of relief moved through the room. Several technicians leaned back in their chairs. One employee laughed nervously. Another rubbed his eyes and whispered, "Thank God." Marcus Reed closed the final diagnostic report. Then he stood. His job was finished. Around him, conversations slowly resumed. But something had changed. People looked at him differently now. Not because of the old documents. Not because of the photograph. Because they had watched him work. They had watched him stay calm while everyone else panicked. They had watched him solve a problem without humiliating anyone. And they had watched him help people who hadn't treated him fairly. That kind of respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. As Marcus gathered his jacket, Cassandra Vale stepped forward. The control room immediately grew quieter. Not because she was the CEO, because everyone knew this conversation mattered. For a moment, Cassandra looked at the floor, then back at Marcus. "I owe you an apology." Marcus said nothing. The silence wasn't hostile. It simply gave her room to continue. "I was so focused on protecting the company that I stopped listening." Her voice tightened. "And people paid for that mistake." Nobody interrupted. The room listened. Not to a CEO. To a person finally being honest. Cassandra took a slow breath. The board wanted results. The investors wanted certainty. I convinced myself that confidence was more important than questions. Marcus nodded slightly. He understood pressure. Maybe not at her level, but he understood it. Then Cassandra held out a folder. Inside was an employment offer. Executive title. Major salary increase. Corporate authority. The kind of opportunity most people spent years chasing. "We'd like you to lead infrastructure reliability for every property we own." Marcus glanced at the folder, then closed it. Not rejecting it. Just setting it aside. His first question surprised everyone. "How many employees are still here?" Cassandra blinked. "What? The overnight staff? The maintenance teams? The security crews? How many stayed?" A supervisor quickly answered, "Almost all of them." Marcus nodded. "Good." The room understood. Even now, he was thinking about people before position. The gesture said more than any speech could. A few minutes later, Marcus left the control room. Several employees stopped him in the hallway. A security guard shook his hand. A technician thanked him. A housekeeper simply smiled and said, "My daughter was stuck in one of those elevators. Thank you." That one hit hardest, because it reminded Marcus why he came back. Not for executives, not for investors, for people. Outside, the harbor air felt cool and clean. The city lights reflected across the water, and for the first time all night, Marcus felt something close to peace. When he finally arrived home, dawn was beginning to break across the horizon. The apartment door opened quietly, but Ava was already awake. She sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket. The paper lighthouse rested beside her. The moment she saw him, she smiled. "You fixed it." Marcus smiled back. "Yeah." "Did everybody get home safe?" There it was again. The question that mattered most. Marcus nodded. They did. Ava handed him the paper lighthouse. One corner had bent slightly. Marcus carefully straightened it. Then, together, they carried it to the apartment window overlooking the harbor. Far in the distance, the hotel stood illuminated against the morning sky. Ava placed the lighthouse on the windowsill. Father and daughter stood side by side, watching the lights. The hotel would remember the outage. The executives would remember the lesson. But Marcus would remember something else. A little girl who reminded him where he was supposed to go when things got dark. And in the quiet light of morning, that felt like the real victory. One of the most important lessons in life is that true character is revealed when we have every reason to walk away, but choose to do the right thing anyway. Marcus could have let anger, pride, and humiliation guide his decision after being fired. Instead, he remembered that real strength isn't about proving people wrong. It's about staying true to your values when it's hardest. The people trapped in that hotel didn't cause his pain, and he refused to let bitterness define who he was. In a world that often rewards the loudest voices, Marcus reminds us that integrity, responsibility, and quiet courage leave the deepest impact. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones that make us look powerful. They're the ones that allow us to look in the mirror with pride. What would you have done if you were in Marcus's position? Would you have gone back to help after being publicly humiliated? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every comment and would love to hear your perspective. If you enjoy inspiring stories about fatherhood, resilience, hidden strength, and hard-earned respect, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.